So recently, Republicans were joined by more than a dozen Democrats to get together in a great bipartisan effort to help rich people, to help deregulate the banks. Now, the bill would loosen regulations on banks worth about $50 billion to $250 billion worth of assets. Now, the specifics is that those institutions would not have to pass what would be what is called a stress test to make sure that they would be strong enough to survive any sort of financial disaster like we had in 2008. It's a response to the 2008 financial crisis. Well, this bill, of course, like I said, would eliminate those stress tests and make it even more likely for these banks, these financial institutions, to crash. So it's a bad idea. Now, Heidi Heitkamp, she's a senator from North Dakota, and she co-sponsored this piece of legislation. Now, PBS's Judy Woodruff asked her if she agrees with the concern that this could lead to another bailout. I want to give you her answers here. She says, in response to that question, I think that's completely overstating the case. She said, I think at the top of the hour, you said that they're no longer going to be subject to stress tests, meaning the banks. She said, that's not true. The Fed has complete ability to stress test and put anyone back into that designation if it's appropriate. We have not changed the rules as it relates to whether the Fed can stress test these institutions. Basically, she's arguing, hey, man, look, there's little to no change in this bank deregulation bill. So it's fine. It's fine. It's not really going to do a whole lot. Well, my question to that is, why then did all the lobbyists go and lobby so hard for this bank deregulation bill? Remember this, I believe Elizabeth Warren called it the Bank Lobbyist Act because it had so much lobbying on Capitol Hill. I don't know. What are your thoughts about this, Dustin?
You know, as the senator from North Dakota, and this includes Hoeven and Kramer, and you know, what I really don't understand about this whole, like, and I'm for regulating banks, but in North Dakota, we have the one and only public bank. The Bank of North Dakota is owned by the people, was created by the Nonpartisan League almost 100 years ago, and that's how they fought corporations. You know, how is it that these North Dakota representatives are not looking to the model that's been basically holding this state up for almost a century and bringing those ideas to Washington? I mean, I'm for regulating banks, but like you just said, it's the Bank Lobbyist Act. There's so many lobbyists and lawyers and everything. We need to go to a public banking system. You know, Ben Franklin ran the Bank of Pennsylvania, and other states recently in the last 10 years have been pushing legislation to try and create their own state banks. And I think that's more of a better path on that. And you know, Heidi Heitkamp's one of the top bank donors. So, I mean, it really doesn't surprise me. So
you pointed to why she would do this, right? Why she didn't go for a state banking system. And let me point it out. TYT Investigates reporter Alex Koch he looked into Heitkamp's investments and found that, guess what? She's got a lot of investment in some of the banks that are going to benefit greatly from this piece of banking legislation. In fact, one of the bill's architects, Heitkamp, and her husband have nearly $1 million invested in two of the biggest winners, J.P. Morgan Chase and Berkshire Hathaway. That's Warren Buffett's hedge fund. And this is according to a 2016 financial disclosure document. But her argument is, no, this will help small community banks. In fact, she said, the small banks, as we understand it, there would no longer be some protections. I'm sorry, that's wrong quote here. She says, these banks are run by your neighbors, they're owned by your neighbors. They have been doing business for years and generations in these communities, and I think they know better what the community needs than a federal regulator. So she's saying, no, look at me, I'm looking out for the small banks, the community banks. But some of these largest banks, J.P. Morgan, she has investments in, they're under $250 billion in assets. They're not exactly a small bank. Did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, the only thing I would say about that is you're absolutely right. I mean, basically we're turning into a system where the banks are retaking control. And we're going to this model where the two-party system is molding itself together. And this exact same thing happened, and that's 100 years ago. And that's when the Nonpartisan League stood up and they created the Bank of North Dakota. And that's what we need to do. We need to stand up. We need to make these things happen. We need to get people out to vote, and because we can't continue down this path anymore.
Speaking of the path that we're going down, and we're going down it because of the donations. Look, Heitkamp, among a lot of the other senators who put forward this piece of legislation, it turns out they had a lot of donations from these banks. Heitkamp is one of the commercial banking industry's #1 recipient of campaign donations. She's reported receipts of $157,000 from banks, employees, and political action committees. The JP Morgan PAC also gave $5,000 to her leadership PAC, the Dakota Prairie PAC. Citigroup also donated $1,500 to Heitkamp through its political action committee in 2017. So the money in politics is also one thing that we definitely need to get rid of. We need to get that money out, because when you have all that money in our political system, you get representatives that don't represent you. You get representatives like Heidi Heitkamp that, like I said, take a lot of money from the banks and don't back a banking system, a public banking system that actually works and that's actually responsive to the American people, to its consumers. Okay, I figured you might want to weigh in.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. As a Wolfpack member last year, myself and many others went to the state legislature and we lobbied for campaign finance reform that was shot down along party lines. I'm proud to say that all the state Democrats voted for campaign finance reform, but with all this money coming in, that's exactly it. I mean, you look at what happened in South Dakota with their ballot measure, where they tried to make public campaign finance, and it passed the voters, and then the legislators just overrode them and shut the whole thing down. I mean, it's just remarkable that these people, like you say, they just do not represent us.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYT Nation.